And we're live.
Okay, and here we are. Good morning to everybody. Here we are. I will note that I have a new camera, which I'm still figuring out, and somehow which makes me feel very yellow. But I'm here, and I'm crisper than I ever was before. Welcome to History Matters, and so does coffee very, very much for me this morning. As I said in a late night tweet yesterday, I did not have time to ponder in deep thought what I wanted to talk about today because school started. I was frantically learning to Zoom teach, and a rescue bird ended up being given to me, and I had to run around and buy a cage and everything else, and he's over there. Anyway, so because of all of that, at around 10 o'clock last night, I think, I said, anything goes! We're going to have an open discussion. So that is what we're going to be doing today. It's an anything goes day when we can really have a discussion, see what people want to talk about, see if I have something to say about what people want to talk about. And for those of you who might be new, we meet here every Thursday morning, 10 o'clock, and talk about in some way or another history and its connection with the present. So that's what we're going to plunge into doing this morning. But before we do, my sound is bad? That's not good.
Really, I can hear you just fine.
Yeah, so, oh, okay. Maybe Becky, might be your sound is bad. Okay, I'm sorry, Becky. I didn't mean to insult you.
We all had techno panic there.
I know. At any rate, what I was about to say is, before we plunge into our anything goes discussion, I am turning you over to my partner in crime, Matt, who will offer the instructions for asking questions as we go along.
Well, and thank you, everybody. We're glad to be here. And wow, actually a decent crowd considering that Joanne and I both had rough weeks and
didn't promote it at all.
We really did not. It was, and a holiday on Monday, I think, just makes it worse because all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, it's Thursday.
That's true. So
but thank you. Exactly. But thank you all for being here. And so our usual format here today is we encourage you to use the chat for things that are germane to our conversation and family friendly, to have all kinds of good comments and things in the chat. If you do have questions, put those in the Q&A. That would be really helpful. That way we have some sort of specific questions separate from what's going on in the chat, and we keep track of those. And as always, if you enjoy... What's that?
No one can see you.
No one can see me?
Well, I can't see you. I only see me.
Oh, that's okay.
Okay.
You're the spotlight, so I'm just here.
Keep going.
And as always, if you like our content here at the National Council for History Education, please, you are encouraged to visit our new website, www.ncheteach.org, and look around and have some fun and look at all of our videos and all of our content, and please become a member. We'd love to have you join us for some important things. One thing I will mention, history teachers out there, we're coming up on our deadline for to submit presentations for our national conference coming up next April. It'll be online, so you don't have to, there's no travel involved. It's just Zoom world. And it's going to be really fabulous. We're working on a lot of really great things. It's going to be really dynamic. So if you want to present and you have great ideas, please put those, please go to our website. And I just want to promo that because we're always looking for really great ideas to explore in history and history education. So, and with that, I'll turn it over to Joanne. I expect, since anything goes, this will be a little more conversational in general.
I need your consent on a few items to continue.
Uh-oh.
That was my phone for some reason going crazy. I have no idea why.
Okay.
So Joanne.
Okay.
Evelyn, good place to start. Can you say something about women in the Revolution? They seem to be forgotten in most history. This is from Evelyn.
I can definitely start there. I will say good morning again, and I will also say that indeed, if there's anyone out there who is new to History Matters, and so does coffee, this is going to be a much more throughout conversational session than typically, because it is an anything goes discussion. Normally I talk for 20 minutes or 30 minutes, and then we open things up for questions. So this is atypical. It will be fun and freewheeling, but it is atypical. Okay, so now Evelyn, women in the revolution, sure. First of all, actually, I will mention, I don't know how many weeks ago I mentioned Rosie Zagari's book, Revolutionary Backlash, but it's specifically about really not just women in the revolution, but then what happens after the revolution. And as the word backlash in the title suggests, doesn't necessarily go well. But the fact of the matter is the revolution, I think as revolutions do, politicized everything, and a war effort means that people are in that effort and engaged in the war in a way that does not necessarily normally happen. So women were part of the war effort, and whether that meant boycotting goods, or whether that meant taking over farms or family businesses while their husbands, brothers, sons were out fighting, whether it meant making or collecting supplies for soldiers in one way or another, women became engaged in that cause, and in that sense became politicized and became part of the sort of public presence. I was going to say political / citizen presence. They got a different sense of their involvement in civic / political society. So they mattered a lot in a lot of different ways. They also mattered actually because women, because of people, how do I put this? Women collected together to celebrate various things at times during the revolution too, and that mattered. Big collections of women were seen by men as a real sign of, you know, that's a serious celebration. So anyway, in one way or another, they were very present, they were necessary, they got a sense of themselves in a different kind of a way. And then of course, when the new government begins 1789, suddenly there are a lot of men who are anxious about the fact that there are women who have a sense that somehow or other they belong in the public sphere in a way that they weren't before. And that's when the backlash starts. The very, very short answer to Evelyn's question is women were very involved in the war effort. And you're right, they tend to get eliminated or overlooked unless you're a savvy historian like Rosemary Zagari or others who have dealt with them. But it's easy, let me put it this way, it's easy to write about the revolution and eliminate that entirely. And that's not, as so many other forms of history are not accurate if you suggest there's only one path. This is one of those examples in which you can focus on one aspect of it, but there's a lot of other things happening that might be right off center stage, but are an important part of the story. Timothy says, Saltpeter and Pins. Yes, 1776. For those of you who have seen that movie or seen the play, Saltpeter and Pins. Abigail was making saltpeter along with the women of whatever club and society she talks about in the song for the troops. And that's an accurate suggestion. So,
and actually speaking of Timothy, it's a great segue into his question, which is, regarding the colonial church, outside of New England and New Jersey's Witherspoon's appointment as congressional chaplain, what characterized the dynamic relationship between religious movements and revolutionary politics?
Okay.
Very, very light question.
I know. Woo. Wow, there are several ways to answer that. I guess I would say, in the colonies generally, the colonies tended to be, and then the United States, tended to have more of a focus on religion than back in the old country. And some of that happens to be because people came to the colonies for reasons of religious persecution, so that helps. But also there was not one denomination that was given, supreme authority. I mean, in different colonies, there were different situations, but the fact of the matter is, there was more choice. That becomes more true over time. But I think because of people's involvement in religion and because of the sense that you were a little bit the master of your own destiny in that realm, it linked up with some of the revolutionary fervor. And that remains true. Like as the Republic sort of matures and extends west, and you begin to get even more, or certainly many more people within many more denominations, that becomes equally true as well. That it becomes part of the spirit of sort of democratizing, right? It gives you a sense that you can choose your destiny in some way, even if it comes to the choice of religion. So religion mattered. There were indeed chaplains that went along with the troops, and it mattered that they were there. So yeah, it was part of the same spirit. It kind of went along in the same spirit, but it had, even from an early period, a kind of American tinge to it because of the ways in which people and the reasons why people came to the colonies, and then just the nature of things in the colonies. I mean, that's also true for things like, not to beam off from religion, but it's what just popped into my mind, representation, right? If you were in the colonies, in a colony, you probably had some kind of charter or paper document that laid out the terms by which you were there. So colonists tended to expect that kind of paper document. You know, they were not assuming that things like, you know, like the Magna Carta, that there would be, and that there would be sort of a general understanding. They wanted to see things on paper. So paper constitutions mattered a lot. And because the colonies were small and initially people were clustered together, you tended to know pretty well the people who represented you. So both of those things changed the tone and the tenor of representation in the colonies in a way. So there are any number of things in the colonies that, even though they were following in the pattern set back in England, just because of the circumstances in the colonies, it did not play out the same way. And over time, those distinct aspects of the colonies and then the United States move in their own direction.
So Carolyn brings up a person we actually have not spoken to. I'm guaranteeing none of us have spoken to this person since he's been dead for a considerable amount of time, but we have not spoken about this person very much.
Now I'm scared.
Thomas Paine.
Oh, okay.
Comment on his role in the revolution. We actually, and now that this question is before me, I realize we actually in 23 weeks have not talked about him very often.
That's true. I'm very sorry, Mr. Paine. I feel very bad now. Paine mattered a lot. And, you know, I suppose if you had a list of, 10 things people know about the American Revolution, it might be common sense and Thomas Paine. I don't know. But the fact of the matter is common sense mattered a lot. I mean, he mattered overall, but that particular pamphlet, because of the way he did it, because of the message in it, and because of its timing, had a real impact. So, it's tempting to think of the colonies breaking away from the mother country in one big burst, but that's not how it happened. And initially, the colonies were blaming Parliament for the problems that were going on, and then they were blaming, bad ministers to the king. It was very hard, and initially people did not blame the king. The king was, as an English subject, the king was the king. You stay loyal to the king. That mattered a lot. So the colonists did not automatically sort of break away from a king. They remained loyal. That was the last sort of tie that helped spin things into revolution. And part of what led to the breaking of that tie was Thomas Paine's common sense. It was radical in a lot of different ways. It was written stylistically. It was really straightforward. He didn't include, Latin terms. He wasn't speaking to an elite population. It was written in a way that anyone would be able to read, understand, and get. He was radical in his message. I think it's in common sense that he says the royal brute of Great Britain. He insults the king and really, denounces what he's doing and suggests that, why assume that a monarch is some special character when we're getting an example every day of the fact that this monarch is mistreating us. So common sense, it's popular. It was very inexpensive, so people could read it. It's written so that it can have a wide audience. It has this radical message in it. It had a huge impact. And when you look at people wrestling with what they think about the politics of the time, common sense has an impact. It enables people to take even a half a step back and think about the king and think about monarchy and think about what independence might mean, what it might mean to break away from the king. So it's highly significant. And he goes on during the revolution to write other pamphlets. You know, these are the times that try men's souls. There are, you know, if there's maybe not the top 10, maybe the top 30 things that people know about the revolution, there would be other quotes that you could throw out there. And these are the times that try men's souls might be one. So he was highly, highly significant and playing a role that he wanted to play, which was really inspiring people and pushing people and goading people, not just the elite, to really think about where they are. Now, the interesting thing about Common Sense is that at the end of the pamphlet, he also included some thoughts about what kind of government might be suitable for the colonies if they began to establish their own government. And, you know, this was I don't want to call it a game. People at the time of all kinds spent a lot of time pondering, like, if we were independent, then what? You know, what would it look like? And Paine took his part and did his thing, and John Adams did not like it. It's not a surprise.
Do tell.
I know, he really did not like it, and I'm not going to be able to. I think he called his suggestions a crapulous mass. I think I'm connecting Adams, the quote, and Paine properly. He really didn't like it. He thought it was irresponsible. He thought, you know, you're not supposed to just toss off ideas willy-nilly about government. You need to think really seriously about who the people are. You know, people, let's see, I guess simile. At any rate, whatever the proper word is, people talked at the time a lot about the fact that you fit a government to a people like you fit a coat, a jacket to a person. It needs to fit. You need to be responsible. You need to think about what people will do and what they can actually do and how it will actually function. And you shouldn't be blue skying to too great a degree. And I think Adams thought that's what Paine was doing. So Paine is radical, but you know, people didn't run off necessarily down that path with flags. And John Adams wasn't the only guy who had issues. But that's my initial take on Thomas Paine. But yeah, I mean, you know, if you're teaching or studying the Revolution, reading Common Sense and understanding that it comes just before or months before the decision to declare independence, that really, it's a major part of the story.
Abigail wants to know if anyone has figured out where Thomas Paine's body is.
Okay, I did not. So the long story is we don't know where Thomas Paine's body is. Now, I haven't looked this up in a long time. He was in transit between England and the United States on a ship. I'm going to get the list, the trail of events wrong. He was in transit, then his bones were actually in someone's barn, and they went from a father to a son, and then they were sold and the bones were there. Anyway, the fact of the matter is Thomas Paine drifted around a good deal, and then ultimately, and one question was where he would land, right? Because did England really want to take him back? Not necessarily, so he should be buried in the colonies, but where? But anyway, and maybe in some ways this is meaningful, but he ultimately ended up lost. We don't know, or at least the last time I taught my Revolution course, so I talk about this, I talk about Common Sense. There's a whole lecture on Common Sense when I teach my Revolution lecture course. And before I stand up and do it every year, I go to my computer and I search to see if anyone found Thomas Paine. I didn't do that before this conversation, so I am not speaking with the latest news. But as far as I know, you would think we would notice, or someone would say something loudly if he'd been found. So yeah, we do not know where Thomas Paine is, which is kind of shocking considering what I just said,
right,
about his significance.
That sounds like that's like a subplot of Game of Thrones or something. That whole, like, you know. Francesca wanted to turning our attention to something a little bit different. In reference, and this is in celebration of the High Holy Days that are approaching. A Jewish question. Were there many Jews involved in the revolution?
There were. I mean, on all levels. So there are certainly, Jewish colonists engaged in the cause like anyone else. There were Jewish men of business who helped to finance things. I don't remember, I haven't looked up Chaim Solomon for a long time, but I know he was engaged in that process. So there were indeed Jews engaged in the revolutionary cause in a lot of different ways. It's their presence early on, and even early on with the national government. It's an interesting case because there are enough Jews present that they exist there and are noticeable, but not so much that it wouldn't be easy to dismiss them in some way. And so early on in the government, there's some concern, that people ask Washington what he thinks about this, how is he going to treat the Jews? Jews want to know. So it's an issue, and it's something that people are looking at. This gets back to the religion question because the response, and Jefferson loves saying this too, right? Well, your religion has no impact on me. It doesn't hurt me in any way. Pick a religion. Jews came forward because, we Jews are very forward. We ask our questions. They wanted to know. So now what for us? Like, is this going to be okay? And that answer was basically, it's okay. Now, that's easy for me to say and not necessarily uniformly the way the Jewish experience in the colonies and then the early United States was, but it was not necessarily unfriendly. And there are a number of different Jews who played a major role. There's a guy named Mordechai Noah, no question about the fact that he's Jewish. Mordechai Noah decided in the late 18th and early 19th century that he wanted to create a Jewish homeland in the United States. And he picked, I want to say, Governor's Island, one of the New York islands, I believe, that he was going to make a Jewish homeland. Obviously, it did not happen, but he was talking about it, right? And it was a discussion. So that's an indication of the fact that this is another, we already said, women and the revolution don't get discussed very often. There's a lot of stories here that certainly scholars have looked at, but that haven't woven their way into the narrative that we tell about this time period, about the early United States, and that deserve to be told.
Just a quick reminder, folks, a couple great questions popped in. Rod, you had one. Can you put those in the Q&A for me so I can keep track of what's been asked and what hasn't? And there was another one maybe by Tim a little while ago that, again, try to get those in the Q&A for me. So
while you're looking, I will comment. Temple Israel. Indeed, the Jewish congregations wrote to Washington. I didn't know about South Carolina, but yeah, I mean, it was an open thing. They were congratulating, they were present. So yeah, like I said, it's a story I haven't delved into very deeply. Scholars have, but it would be nice if it became, as well as the story and engagement of women and other people who are not elite white men or even common folk white men, was woven into the narrative in a more aggressive way for the public, the general public, and in the sort of national narratives that we tell about our country. Anissa,
and again, apologize for not pronouncing it correctly, asks, I'm gonna tweak your question just a little bit because when we say the founders, they are not a monolithic thing. So her question is just, what did the founders think the relationship between the three branches should be? And I think starting off with this idea that there was probably quite a bit of debate about that relationship, even among the people that we would call the founders. So maybe we could use this time to kind of elaborate on that. So what is what did the people at the time sort of have conversations about the relationship between the three branches of government? Should they be collaborative, antagonistic, some blend of the two? What should be the relationship between the judicial and executive, especially, is what she wants to know about.
Okay. So that's an answer with several parts. Generally speaking, there was an assumption in some ways that there needed to be branches that were independent. And, you know, the phrase checks and balances it's so familiar we don't think about it. But that's what it's about, right? That the whole debate over the Constitution is not just a paper debate, but what's at the heart of that debate is how power will be channeled. Who has power? What kind of power do they have? How do American citizens give that power? Who do they give it to? And how is it channeled, right? And so part of the idea of having separate branches of government is having different channels of power, and each power base can check another, so that you are making a government that is less likely to fall into what they would have considered the two extremes, you know, despotism or anarchy. Ideally, this kind of balance would prevent things from spinning out of control. Now, and that's why, you know, in the Constitution, there's a lot of discussion about the relationship of each branch to the other branches. That said, the Constitution is a really bare bones document if you think about all that it does. And, you know, so it might say certain things about how things are supposed to operate, but even at this very early point, the fact of the matter is people weren't entirely sure how that would play out on the ground. So as far as the actual relationship, the working relationship between the branches, some of that was being wrestled with and figured out as the machine was already in motion. Like people were trying things out and then seeing how it worked. I don't think I've told this story already, and if I have, I'm going to tell it again anyway, but it's a great example of this, right? So the Senate is supposed to, the executive branch is supposed to bring treaties, right? The Senate is supposed to advise and consent on treaties. So Washington has a treaty, a treaty with Native Americans, and the Constitution says the Senate's supposed to advise and consent. So he walks over to the Senate with a treaty, and he has it read out loud to the Senate. And we have the diary of a senator who was there at the time. And, you know, he says he and the senators are sitting there, and Washington has the treaty read aloud and basically then says, advise and consent, you know, go. And the Senate, you know, the senators are kind of looking at each other like, how does this work? Like, are we really supposed to like instantly, this is the president and it's Washington and we respect him, but how much do we? And so there's literally a moment there when people are trying to figure out how the power is going to integrate, how executive and legislative are supposed to work together. And ultimately, first one senator stands up and says, you know, there was a carriage going by when you had it read the first time, so could you have it read again so that we could hear better, right? Mm-hmm. Actually, I think buying time, but still, just read it a second time. So it's read a second time, and then there's another pregnant pause in which people are trying to figure out what to do. And the guy whose diary he left behind, William McClay, Pennsylvania senator, stands up and says, you know, I think we want a little time to think about it. You know, I think we can't instantly advise and consent. I think we'd like to have a discussion. And Washington throws a fit, right? Washington apparently, like literally loses his temper and says, essentially, this defeats the whole purpose of my coming here. And he storms out of the Senate. And from that point on, the president does not go to the Senate for advice and consent. He sends things along and then waits for them to act. So there's a ground level moment of interaction between the branches that no one quite knows how it's supposed to work. And it's worked out in a kind of accidental way. And there's a lot of that going on in this period. Of course, there are other battles that the Supreme Court is also helping to figure out that kind of relation in. But, you know, it's one of the things I love about this time period is that there's an improvisational nature to it. And it's very much about who has power and how they use it and how they get it. That to me is fascinating, that you have a group of people, and not just elite people, who understand that there are precedents being set and terms being established and the legacy of the revolution being figured out, and those are big stakes. And so people are improvising and thinking about the improvisation on a lot of different levels, and then writing about it, right? In some ways or another, it's on paper. That to me is fascinating. And this one little incident is an example of the kinds of things that I always find really interesting.
Before I ask the next question, Kaylee, could you just send us a chat message to just the panelists? Are you referring to Ella Baker, the civil rights leader, or is there a different Ella Baker you're referring to? Excuse me. Okay, so Anne asked a question about Abigail Adams' letter, Remembering Women. I don't know if you're familiar with the letter specifically, but
Remember the ladies.
and so what are your thoughts about Abigail Adams' letter, March 31st, 1776, about remembering the women, and John's response with, quote, "As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh," end quote. And he wrote that on April 14th.
Right. So indeed, it kind of links in with what I was just saying, right? This is earlier, but still, there's a discussion about, you know, Abigail is part of this discussion. I mean, she actually is very politically engaged with her husband and has opinions that she is not afraid to express in any way. And the letter is an example. But, you know, she sends this letter that basically says, remember the ladies, you know, as you're doing whatever it is you're doing, remember the ladies. Now, I think that modern day readers of that look back and see that as this radical declaration of women's rights. And at the time, I don't think she meant it that broadly. You know, I think she's thinking of things like coverture, that men have, you know, ownership of, women basically vanish into their husbands when they marry, and any number of other things that were unfair to women that basically needed to be reformed in some way. Particularly, you would feel that if you were a woman. So she is saying, remember the ladies, but we have to understand it in the meaning of the time, rather than imposing a modern thought about it. But yeah, Adams's response is it doesn't make him any worse than anybody else. Actually, in a sense, he's better because he's actually having the conversation. But, yeah, you know, his basic, you know, yeah, whatever, not right now. You know, it's a polite version of what others might do or say. I mean, another version of this is, I guess it's Albert Gallatin. When Jefferson is president, Albert Gallatin asks Jefferson in a letter, what do you think about women office holders? Women holding, I don't know if it's a letter or if it's in person, but he asked Jefferson what Jefferson thinks of women office holders, and Jefferson is like, like that's not even like, where that's what? So, you know, the idea came up, it caused anxiety. Women and rights, women and power, women and government. It's part of the discussion. There's a reason why there's a backlash, as I suggested earlier. It's because things are happening and things are being loosed, and there's some change in the air, and some men, you know, step forward to kind of halt that because it feels too radical.
Mm-hmm. Which is miles better than writing an anonymous, lengthy, deeply sarcastic, I don't know what the word is, exploration of a woman wanting to be a doorkeeper.
And I've been thinking about that the whole time I've been answering. There are some of you who probably were here for that conversation, but we were talking about anxiety about women in this time period. And the document that I brought to that discussion was a satirical essay in an early newspaper at the very start of the government. And the satire was grounded on the fact that there was a woman named Roxana Wilhelmina Pompencrest, which clearly is an invented name, who was putting herself forward to be the doorkeeper of Congress. And it's totally satirical. She'll wear a really tall wig, so she'll be tall enough, and she has grand jewels, so she'll be dominating and impressive enough. And it's making fun of the very idea that women would serve that role, and talk about symbolism, the doorkeeper of Congress. So yeah, there's that kind of anxiety going on, and that satirical essay is a great example of attempts to quash that before that goes anywhere. So. And John says there's so much else going on in that letter. There is, and as a matter of fact, I will put that in the back burner of my brain, and maybe at some point we can talk about the exchange of letters as the main documents that we talk about on a different Thursday. So thank you for bringing that up and for saying that, because that would be an interesting, and I think in some ways revealing conversation, because I do think we put a lot of modern meanings into that exchange that aren't there, but for that very reason, it's even more interesting to pull apart. So I will put that in my brain.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the origins of executive privilege as a concept and
executive privilege.
practice in the United
Yes.
States?
Okay.
This
So
is from this is from our test. So those of you who are, Joanne knows this, but we did send out basically a Google form so you could ask questions ahead of time. This is one, and I think it's from Rabbi Beth. So, and the question is, would you talk about the origins of executive privilege as a concept and a practice in the United States?
Okay, so that falls into the category of how does this work, right? I mean, there's not a clear dividing line relating to that specific issue in the Constitution, and I may get something wrong here, but I believe that it's in relation to the Jay Treaty. During Washington's administration, there is an episode when Congress wants to see some matters relating to the executive branch. And the question is, does the executive branch have to provide those to Congress? And it's debated, and Washington and Hamilton, I think, believe that no, they shouldn't have to, but that's not decided. And so the idea of executive privilege is not established. It's still being debated. There isn't a clear precedent. And in obvious ways, the tension of that, which is the executive branch wanting to preserve its independence and not be as indebted to the legislative branch as the legislative branch might want, and you know, Congress pushing back by saying, yeah, wait a minute, this is our function. That struggle goes very, very early on. It's way back into the dawn of the Republic, because it's a logical place for power to be debated and pulled at. And that, you know, that's not, there isn't a moment, a clear moment in time that it's like, and after January 8th, 1798, right, it was established. It's debated over time. It is an issue that gets a lot of debate, because obviously there's a lot going on there. And that changes in part as technology changes, although even before great technological changes, you know, there are times in which there might be papers that the executive would like to keep to itself, but some of them are leaked to the newspapers. What a surprise. And so people get access to things that maybe the executive branch wouldn't have been so thrilled for them to get access to. So this is an active conversation. And obviously, in a lot of ways that we can imagine right now, it's one that matters a lot.
Well said. Irene wants to know about the concept of civic virtue in revolutionary America and the early republic, especially how they thought it could be cultivated in the citizenry. So what was civic virtue, and how can it be cultivated during the revolutionary era?
Well, basically, generally speaking, there was a sense that there should be a shared civic spirit pulling people together in shared cause. And during the active part of the revolution, so during the fighting, there was what some at the time called, you know, the rage militaire. It was this fervor about the war that brought people together, and they had, you know, sort of patriotic spirit, and they came together as a people, and blah, blah, blah. When the war ended and we shifted into the 1780s, that dissolved. And suddenly, you know, people are looking around and they're like, do we have any shared anything that we are, you know, between states? Where are we now? So when the new government actually kicks in, and you know, we have the convention, we create the Constitution, the new government kicks in. One of the things that people are really debating is, in a republic as opposed to a monarchy, a republic is different from a monarchy in a lot of ways, but one of the main ways is a republic is really grounded on the public to an extreme degree, which means the morals of the public matter to an extreme degree, because they are the people who are going to recognize threats and give people power. So very early on, there becomes an active debate about how to instill the proper virtues and values and morality in the American populace. The small r republicanism is kind of an umbrella term for this idea. And this is one reason why women's education becomes an issue in the 1790s, because the logic, the train of logic goes, well, women are the people who will be training future citizens of the Republic, so they need to be prepared to teach their children in one way or another the right values, which means they need to have a proper education, which means that we need to think about how women are getting educated. And so this question of morality and virtue it's widespread in the implications that it has. And it's part of the reason why education is discussed a lot in a general way, and women's education specifically. It's not just seen as a question of different rights, but it's seen as a fundamental political issue that could mean do or die for the Republic. One of the distinctive things about the American Republic when it's created is the fact that it's not a monarchy, it's more grounded on the public, and what the heck does that mean? And morality and virtue is part of that. There's a lot of discussion. This always has fascinated me. If you ask someone, or certainly ask the political folk who are helping to institute this new government, what just happened there?
I don't know, but it got you like mid-sentence. I was a little concerned it was me.
That was scary. Okay, definite technical weirdness. So I was talking about, remind me, because I was so busy wrestling around here. Let me open chat again. But before the technical weirdness, what was I talking about? Because it's now gone out of my brain. We got past women in education. Teaching
women.
Now we're beyond executive privilege. Oh, public opinion. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, this civic virtue. The question about civic virtue, public opinion.
Right. That people didn't know who the public was. They didn't know. Polling didn't exist in the way we have it now. So how do you figure out the public? And I was saying, I know that I might have told this story before, but there's an anecdote about people being sent out into Virginia to collect to collect public opinion. I have to shut up soon. Well, no, I don't have to shut up soon because we're doing Q&A. I'm so programmed to speak for a half hour and then shut up. That people were sent out into Virginia to collect public opinion, and then they came back and they reported to Madison and Jefferson that people were actually relatively okay with Hamilton's financial plan, and Madison's response was, "You asked the wrong public," right? So that's an issue too. So women's education matters, morality matters, who is the public matters, how do you figure out what they think? All of these things that among many that we take for granted are being figured out in a really pragmatic ground level kind of way, which I always find really fascinating.
So Melissa asked a couple questions here. Try to find one of them that'll work for our conversation today. I like this question. This is a good one.
Uh-oh.
Why did the founding men worry about aristocratic ruffles while behaving as natural rulers over others?
Okay.
Like,
that's an excellent question. And indeed, the elite political men, and particularly national elite political men, worried a lot about what their clothing looked like and how much lace they should have, and a lot of things that sound very frivolous to us and did not feel frivolous to them. And the reason is, so Americans, and particularly power holders, they looked back to the old country, the mother country, and what they saw was people who were very obviously aristocrats, dressed in the way that we assume aristocrats should dress, courtiers, right? Part of that whole system. And now you go to the United States, how are you supposed to look as a small R Republican leader? You know, and there's so much fear in the United States about lapsing back into monarchical practices and standards, because that's the default, right? Throughout the 1790s, there's a common assumption that if you slip up just a little bit, the whole country's going to just slip right back into monarchy. So if that's your concern, you're not just going to dress up in your frills and ruffles as you might have in the mother country and then say, let's go. What is an American politician or political leader? What is the culture of politics in the United States? So, you know, and I know I've mentioned this before, but like John Adams was concerned about how much lace he should or shouldn't have on his jacket. George Washington worried about how many horses he should have drawing his carriage because he didn't want to seem too aristocratic. He worried about the design of his tableware, right? He wanted it, and I think if I remember correctly, he wanted things medium, right? In a medium style. So not plain, he needs to be respected, but not aristocratic or frilly. So people were trying to walk some kind of a middle line. And in a way, they were defining American character in this period, and particularly political character, by saying, well, whatever it is, it's not England. And there's a lot of empty space there, right? And so they're inventing something, and their precedent about authority and leadership is the British monarchy, and they can't duplicate that. But what does that mean? And that's part of the improv that I'm talking about here.
And yeah, the Puritan influence is what Francesca put in chat.
Oh, and actually the French Revolution too.
And the French Revolution, yeah.
Yeah, well, the French Revolution, I'll weave that in because that becomes part of this too. You know, and there are different views about the French Revolution. So some people feel that what's going on in France means that the spirit of liberty that's been unleashed in the United States is spreading around the world, and there it is, going to France. And so there's support for it in that way. There are others, and they tend to be the more conservative federalists who are not thrilled with that and just see the French Revolution as anarchy and unrest and, you know, to be avoided at all costs. But so this question about style and leadership, the French Revolution, that was a bird chirp. My new bird actually chirped. The French Revolution gets woven into this as well. And if you dress a certain way, you're suggesting a certain thing about your politics. Actually, in the mid and late 1790s, there were different cockades that you could wear, these sort of ribbon round things that people put on their hats. And one color was Federalist and one color was Republican, but that was a pullover from the French Revolution. So anyway, fashion, you know, it's easy to dismiss culture and fashion and material culture as trivial or unimportant, but people were inventing an American culture in some way, people on all levels, but still, this was an ongoing live debate. And all of those things, as easy as it is to dismiss them, were central to it and were thought about and discussed and attacked if they seemed excessive.
We have about 8 minutes or so before we head to our after party. Kevin wanted to know about the contentiousness of the election of 1800. How did the threats of violence, calamity, collapse ultimately give way to peaceful transition of power?
Oh, no, that's a question. And I will say, at some point, I'm going to go more into detail in that a little closer to our election, because that's a fascinating election. But as far as the specific answer to this question, it is true that in the election of 1800, there ended up being a tie between Jefferson and Aaron Burr. Burr was supposedly running for vice president, but you didn't differentiate at that point on a ticket. You just gave the presidency to the person with the most votes and the vice presidency to the person with the second most, which is how in 1796 you end up with a Federalist president, John Adams, and a Republican vice president, Thomas Jefferson. But in 1800, you get this tie between Jefferson and Burr, and it seemingly can't be broken. And politics is extremely polarized. People on each side are beginning to see the other as, or certainly talk about the other as, not properly American, that they're going to destroy the republic, hide your Bibles, Jefferson is going to destroy religion. Things reach a real peak of anxiety. And then you get this tied election that seemingly can't be broken. And you do get 2 different states, I believe. They're beginning to corral weapons in case they need to intervene in what might be a crisis. And people are talking about what's going to happen. Are the Federalists just going to, seize the government or something? So it's a hyper extreme debate. What's interesting, and in the end, the vote is broken, and I'll go into the logistics of that at another time. But what's interesting and related to this question is after the election, when it's done, someone writes to Jefferson and says, what would have happened if what do you think would have happened if, I don't know, the tie hadn't broken, if things had gone worse, if things had blown up, what would have happened? And Jefferson says, we would have had a convention, we would have repaired the Constitution, and we would have just kept going. So the interesting thing about that statement is there was an assumption, and I talk about this sometimes when I lecture, there was an assumption that the constitutional process and the possibility of amending, that the process was the way that you would sail through crises. Mm-hmm. The crises could get extreme, but if you hung on to the process, which is why the founders were so focused on process during the Federal Convention, if you have a reliable, sound, agreed upon process, during crises, you can hang on to that and it will hold things together. So when I lecture about extreme polarization in early America, that's one of my ongoing messages is process. That's part of why, Madison's extreme detailed notes of what was going on at the Constitutional Convention, he was recording the process of creating the process, right? And that was important. So process matters. And I think if we're gonna, towards the end of our time here, relate past to present, this is a big way in which we can. Process matters. And one of the things that deserves to be talked about and recognized and worried about right now is the degree to which we are continuing to follow along with the process that we have shared and sort of made a pact with each other to follow, which is the Constitution, or the degree to which we're not doing that and we're not abiding by the process, in which, if we're talking, we started out talking about power being delegated and channeled. Well, if you step away from the Constitution and just say, well, power is going to go where it goes, depending on where we can push it, that's a different place, and it's not necessarily a good place. So process, the simple way to talk about this moment is, elections and Supreme Court decisions represent processes that often can dispel moments of extreme crisis, right? Like 1800, you have an election, the public makes a decision, and people are like, okay, there's been a decision. Supreme Court decisions, people are like, yeah, okay, the process is spoken, let's see. So process can indeed calm down crises, and that's why it's important, because if a constitution is a pact between Americans and the process, the constitutional process speaks in a way that a shared process everyone has agreed upon, it allows people to take a breath and see what's going to happen. But the process is important for that reason. It's an agreement. The Constitution is an agreement, and it allows for breathing space. And we're at a moment where there's not a lot of breathing space. It's, as an early American historian, I think, let's just say I think about this a lot. Process and the importance of it, and why it's important, and why I want Americans to understand the absolute importance of the constitutional process, even if we disagree over the nature of it and the boundaries of it and the details of it and the structure of it, the fundamental fact of its existence, and that there's a basic pact that we have as Americans. That's of the ultimate importance. That's actually a fine place to end our discussion.
I think that's a perfect way.
Can't go beyond that in significance.
No, and yeah, absolutely. So, so thank you. I'll let Joanne wrap up here. Just for my own part, thank you everybody for a great conversation today, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Please bring your friends, and we will be better about getting getting it out to you sooner.
Yes.
And thank you for your patience this week. It's just been one of those weeks. So
Okay, and I will wrap things up here. Saying, as Matt just said, we will actually publicize. We will decide, I will decide before 10 o'clock on Wednesday night what we're talking about. We will publicize it as always. We will have a more typical discussion in which it's divided between me blathering and then you folks asking about whatever they want to ask about. In the meantime, I do want to say, particularly, I know that there are, actually, I'm not prepared for this, but next week I will bring it up. There's an award for teachers that is, applications are being accepted now, and I meant to give the details, and of course I don't have them here. But at any rate, particularly to teachers, people like me who are starting the semester, I'm sending you my strong teacher arm, but everyone stay safe until next week. Someone is asking, do we have a mailing list? We do not, right? We have no kind of mailing list yet. We just have the link that we send out every Thursday morning, but it's an interesting idea. We should think about that, Matt.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we have email addresses from if you're a member of NCHE, and you know, we do have some mailing lists through NCHE, but I don't think we have one specific to this group. So
we could easily do that. I mean, we could make a place. We could put it on the page for History Matters. If you want to join the mailing list or the emailing list or whatever we want to call it, put it here. That's a great idea. I love when the people who are here have these great ideas that like we didn't think of, and they're so logical. So we can ponder that, Matt, but I think that might be a fine idea. Yeah, and now we'll shut up because it's after 11 o'clock.
After 11 o'clock. All right, so let's stop our videos and Joanne, last words.
Last words, just for those who don't know. We are now starting the after party, which that name was given by one of our wonderful viewers. What that means is we will turn off the camera, we will stop recording, and we will continue chatting in a less guided way. So if you want to be here for the after party, just stay here, and in a moment the camera will be off and we will continue. Okay, and otherwise, see you guys next week.